Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Data, Privacy, and Security panel, and the second event of the Uber Ignite series, which brings together experts from industry, academia, and the public sector to discuss key opportunities for growth and innovation in the MENA region. My name is Uttara Sivaram, and I lead Uber's global policy work on data privacy and security. I have the privilege of working with our local business and policy teams around the world, prepare and shape new regulations while supporting the growth of our business. It's a sizable task for virtually all of our local teams, given the number of new data protection regulations we're seeing globally, as well as the growing interest and general consciousness among consumers when it comes to their privacy, their data rights, and data access. And with so many basic services moving online, investing in responsible, consumer-focused innovation, as well as common sense regulation is more important than ever. On that note, I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel to discuss these issues in the context of the MENA region. And we have a really brilliant lineup of business and policy experts. So I'm pleased to introduce them. Sam Tayan, Managing Director for Zoom Video Communications in the MENA region, Marwa Fatafta, MENA Policy Manager for Access Now, and Baha Othman, Head of Information Security and Compliance for Faudi. Before I turn it over to our panelists to give a few introductory remarks, just a few housekeeping notes. We're providing a simultaneous translation from English to Arabic on the Arabic version of this website. Also, we encourage you to submit questions in the chat box located on the right-hand side of this viewing panel throughout the session. We'll reserve about 15 minutes at the end of this session for Q&A. So with that, let me turn it to the panelists. Marwa, let me pass the mic to you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much, Uttara, and hello everyone, wherever you are. My name is Marwa, and I lead Access Now's work in the Middle East and North Africa. For those who don't know Access Now, we are a global human rights organization. Our mission is to defend and extend human rights in the digital age, and especially the rights of those who are most at risk. So we focus on freedom of expression issues in the internet era, data protection, both globally and regionally. So I'm very thankful to be part of this conversation, especially for our region where there is a lot to be done on that front. So I look forward to our discussion more with the fellow panelists today.
Thank you so much. Baha, let me pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Uttara. Hello, everyone. I am Baha Othman. I am heading the Information Security and Compliance in Faudi. And Faudi actually is the largest fintech and e-payment company in Egypt. We are processing almost 3 million transactions per day. We have about more than 25 million customers. So in the domain of data privacy, actually, it is very challenging in our company. So I hope you enjoy this discussion. I'm very excited. So let's go.
Excellent. Thank you, Baha. Sam, let me pass it to you to round us out.
Thanks very much, Uttara, and thanks to Uber for this opportunity. Yes, I think we find ourselves in very interesting times, to say the least. I think over the past year and a half or so, we've all found ourselves conducting more and more of our lives virtually over video and audio and technology networks, if we call them that. And I think obviously issues relating to privacy and security and feeling comfortable with these medium are really important. So looking forward to discussing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. So I will start off with a question for everyone, just to kick us off. What do you think are the primary privacy and security issues facing the MENA region? Sam, I'll kick it back to you. What are your thoughts on the opportunities, but also the sort of the challenges that face this region, and how have you sort of navigated that in your role?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty wide subject, so I'll touch on a couple of aspects, certainly. So obviously, one of the things from a Zoom perspective, we've seen a very substantial uptake in people conducting large parts of interaction, such as education, healthcare, and other things like that over Zoom meetings or video meetings. And I think it's one of the things which has become a point for focus has been, people's concerns regarding the disruption that can happen potentially during video meetings. So what we've done at Zoom is we've focused very hard on particularly alleviating that part of it by putting into place not only features and policies, but also user awareness to put together best practices so that when people have online classes, online tutorials, or whatever it may be as an example, that they are comfortable that these will happen disruption-free. And I think often when we discuss security, we may be thinking of aspects such as encryption, et cetera, et cetera. But I think obviously those are very important, but feeling comfortable from a point of view of disruption is equally important. Particularly education, as you know, can involve young children. And I think it's very important to feel that the environment is one where they will benefit from the education without disruptions. I'll just give you one example which we did at Zoom, is we have something called an at-risk meeting notifier. So basically what it means is that we scan Twitter, social media, things like that, and we look out for meetings which may have been posted online, which shouldn't have been, for example, school classes and stuff like that, in order to notify that, hey, your class meeting link may have been posted, maybe it shouldn't be, potentially this puts your class at risk. So these kind of services, particularly in the educational sector, to make sure that classes and education can go ahead disruption-free. And also bearing in mind that often the people using the platform are professional educators. One or two of us, or some of us may be professionals in the technology field, but clearly it's important that everybody feels comfortable in navigating their way around this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just can't imagine, how many, all of us are using Zoom on a day-to-day basis, hours on end. So that probably poses a lot of challenges that you may not have sort of anticipated at first, right? At the scale that you started. And of course there are challenges with scaling, but this has sort of probably been a really dramatic ramp up. And so I just can't imagine the number of things that have come up that you never could have anticipated. Baha, let me pass it on to you. I mean, what has Foudy faced? What are the areas around privacy and data protection that have sort of arisen during this pandemic?
Actually, we may have a similar case to Zoom that after the COVID-19, many are now depending on online payments and fintech. So we suddenly, after COVID-19, we faced a very large, let's say, number of transactions that we're not expecting, actually, this huge number. The world is suddenly transformed to everything is now online. So this was a very challenge for introducing the same service to the customer with the same quality, with this huge number of transactions. And also with the increase of number of transactions, it comes the increase of number of the data collected and the challenges related to how to protect this data. This is the most challenge we are facing after the pandemic, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Marwa, let me pass it to you. I mean, what is the region facing? You know, at Access now, you have a lot of visibility into both, you know, the regulatory side and, you know, what consumers are saying. And I'm keen to hear, you know, what have you observed? What are the issues that are facing this region?
Sure. I mean, in the pandemic, so basically since last year, around springtime, we of course saw governments rushing to technological solutions to, on the one hand, you know, attempt to stop or reduce or slow down the transmission of the COVID-19 virus through contact tracing apps and e-service, I mean, e-health services apps and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we've also, as Sam mentioned, you know, we are basically using technology to somehow adapt and go through this pandemic with little disruption as possible, so students can go to their classrooms. University students can also still continue their studies. Us workers continue our work uninterrupted. And obviously in our region, we have been facing challenges in the past decade or so on how governments are tackling internet regulation, where there is more interest in control rather than allowing for a human right respecting regulation of the internet in a way that users have more control and agency about their personal data, have more space to express themselves and exercise their freedom of expression and so on. And in this pandemic, as I mentioned, many governments in our region rushed to those solutions in a haste without thinking about the cybersecurity side of things, about the privacy side of things. So how are you going to collect and process this personal data? And obviously health data is extremely sensitive personal data. And we've been working whenever possible to address those issues in Tunisia. We've asked the Ministry of Health, for example, to share information on how they rolled out their contact tracing app, how can they ensure that the personal data of users is being respected and not violated. And again, unfortunately, this pandemic has given some sort of a license to roll out those technological solutions without much consideration for the privacy aspect of those technological solutions and what they may mean for the time being, but also for the future. You know, once the pandemic is over, how are we going to use that infrastructure, so to speak, especially that many of those applications or other technological solutions often don't have any sunset clauses on data collection and retention, etc. So there's lots of open question marks about, once this pandemic is over, what are we going to do with this infrastructure that governments have built during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, this is, you know, with contact tracing, not an issue that is, you know, unique to the region necessarily. You know, you see various countries, you know, desperately trying to find a way to, you know, stop the spread. And so, you know, that contact tracing was, you know, understandably something that we wanted to do. But again, scaling what is typically a manual process, right? You know, contact tracing is you know, a traditional, you know, thing for infectious diseases, but scaling it to the level needed for a pandemic introduced so many concerns. And I think that, you know, Marwa, to your point of, you know, we're going to ramp up all of this infrastructure for contact tracing, and then what, right? I think that it has to do with just the lack of data protection and privacy regulation around the world. Right? There's, you know, once this technology is introduced, there's no sort of governance structure for how, you know, how the data will be stored, how long it'll be retained, you know, what rights consumers have over the data once they've sort of shared it with the apps or the government or whoever, you know, is you know, owning that app. So I guess, you know, just to continue that thought, where is data protection legislation in MENA? I mean, where where are we? Are we progressing? How has COVID-19 affected that progression? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. We actually delved into that question at Access Now last year, and we published earlier this year in January a comprehensive study on data protection frameworks in the MENA region. And we looked specifically at 4 countries, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and Tunisia. And in a nutshell, unfortunately, the situation isn't very optimistic. So of the 22 Arab countries in our region, there's only half. So half of those countries have a data protection law or framework in place. And for those who do, such as Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, the framework or the law is either outdated. So for example, in Tunisia, the law was passed in 2004, and actually Tunisia is the first country in our region that passed a data protection law. So like a specific law that aims at protecting the personal data and information of citizens. But as I said, like it was passed in 2004, it hasn't been amended since. And that was, at the time where there wasn't any social media platforms, there wasn't, the internet has changed, many new technologies obviously have evolved. So it doesn't really address the challenges associated with the use of new technologies. And we have been, as a civil society organization with a presence in Tunisia, we've been working with Tunisian organizations to push for a more robust framework. And there was an attempt back in 2018, and unfortunately since then it's been tabled. And for, when it's outdated, in some cases, the law is there, but it contains many problematic clauses. So for example, in Lebanon, there was a law that was passed in 2018, the e-transaction law, but it's extremely ambiguous and vague, so it doesn't really provide much protection to citizens or users. It doesn't define consent for the data subject, so it's not clear whether you as a person or as a data subject can and should give consent and in what form, where it should be actually very explicit. So that's at least according to the principles of GDPR. It prohibits individuals from withdrawing consent if they gave it previously. It also doesn't place any time limits on data retention. It doesn't acknowledge or regulate the processing or the collection of sensitive personal data, such as biometric information, your fingerprints, your iris scans, etc. And this being said, it's important to note that Lebanon has a number of biometric proposals, biometric ID, a biometric license, etc. So they do have biometric passports. So there's a couple of biometric authentication and identification programs in place, but unfortunately the e-transaction law doesn't acknowledge the sensitivity of that information or the classification of this information, which requires a higher threshold for protection, and also so to speak, like ensuring that the collection is actually justifiable and necessary, which is often, unfortunately, not the case. It also doesn't grant individuals the right to be notified when there's a data breach, for example. And it doesn't, grant the individuals the right to know whether their personal data is being processed for whenever it's related to national security. And that leads me to another problematic issue with data protection legislation across the MENA region. There is often a certain carve out for national security agencies when it comes to those data protection laws. And that's unfortunately one of the things that we highlight as a don't. We've worked with data protection laws and regulations around the world, including the EU's GDPR, and we've published a guide for lawmakers and do's and don'ts for what a robust data protection law that ensures that centers the user and ensures that their rights, especially their right to privacy and the right to data protection, is protected and respected. And one of the biggest no's is to ensure that the data protection law applies to all government agencies, including security agencies, and there shouldn't be any exemptions. In some cases, such as the law in Egypt, for example, there is not only a carve out, but the national security agencies are part of the makeup of the future data protection center, which should be an independent oversight body that investigates and look into the compliance with the law. So, and in some cases, again, when it comes to regulation, we see that governments are thinking about the regulation. As I mentioned, in Tunisia, there has been an attempt and there was a draft for a really strong and robust data protection law that is in line with the GDPR principles, which is so far has been the most the strongest, or the strongest principles and guidelines there are so far. And unfortunately, that has been shelved since 2018. Similarly, is the case in Jordan. There has been, I think, since 2014, discussions around a data protection law. The draft in itself went through many rounds, but unfortunately, it's still yet to see the light. And with the COVID-19, so to bring us to the present moment, you'd think that the fact that we all of us conduct our lives online now has brought this issue closer to home, has emphasized the importance of prioritizing data protection laws in the region and for governments in the region. But unfortunately, this hasn't been the case. And as I mentioned earlier, we see the opposite. We see the opposite of, let's do this, let's roll out this data-heavy program, whether it be a digital ID, whether it be digitizing a government services, etc., without really thinking about the data protection side, or thinking, okay, how do we actually regulate the collection and processing of personal data? So we have been, again, calling governments in the region to make that a priority, to make robust data protection legislation in line with GDPR a top priority for parliaments in the region.
Yeah, I actually want to follow up on your note on making sure the data protection legislation is widely applicable to all organizations, because I think that, the way the future is going and the way the way things are right now, there is a tremendous amount of data flow between the public and private sector. And that, to me, being in this gray area, this legal gray area, is going to have consequences to the consumer. And with COVID-19, with so many services moving online, I would imagine, and we have yet to see all the transparency reports for 2020, and I think those are going to be those are going to be good to track. But I think that making sure that any new laws are widely applicable and apply to the public sector, nonprofits, essentially all organizations that are collecting this data, is really going to be really critical for protecting consumers. And actually, Bahai, I'd love to pass it to you to talk about the issue of data sharing and hear how Faudi's sort of, approaching the issue of government data sharing and responding to those requests, and supporting governments, but also, protecting consumers and their data.
Actually, in Egypt, the data privacy law is only 1 year old. And I think laws, just like anything else, it grows in maturity by time. After applying the law, maybe this is the first version of the law. And I think as the first version, it is good enough. It's already missing some items is not covering all scenarios. But as a start, it's okay. It's good at least to have a law for data privacy. Actually, Fowry is dealing with many third party as we are payment processor. So we have many corporates that are using our services in payments. On the other side, we have the government, and the government is always asking for data related to the consumers, the end users, or data related to the corporates we are dealing with. This is very challenging, actually. Without the law, even this first version, I couldn't say no. Now I can say, okay, which data you want to use, and if you have permission to collect this data. Actually, also I have some requests from some customers actually that are requesting some data related to the consumers. Also before this law, before this first version of the law, I couldn't say no, it's the customer. But after the law, even the customer related information, the corporate third party users related information, I can share it unless I know if they actually need it, why they need it, are they authorized to have this information. So actually the law helped me in some scenarios related to the government and the third parties, although it is still missing some parts in how to apply this law. But in these two scenarios that I mentioned, I think it helped me actually to take the decision that protects the customer information. And if I will share information, the information that will be shared is only the information that is needed and for a specific purpose. So that's our experience in this domain in Fowry. And I think by time this will grow, more scenarios will come, more people will join this this community of privacy and talk more about privacy. So I think we are in a good shape somehow.
Okay, so it sounds like, you know, obviously that it's an imperfect law in Egypt, but it's a very important step forward to acknowledging the right to privacy that then, you know, organizations can use to say, you know, we are not only sort of internally adopting these principles, but also using them when we share data externally, right? To say, hey, you know, are you, for example, you know, minimizing the data you collect? Do you actually need this data? Are the you know, purposes and what you're requesting necessary and proportionate to what you want to do with the data? So it sets that, you know, expectation that there is a right to privacy, and that has to be respected with any sort of transfer of personal data. That's what I'm hearing from you, and I would largely agree with that. I think the follow-up question that I have is, do we need a regional framework for data protection in MENA, similar to what you know, we see in GDPR, which is some basic, you know, fundamental rights, but with specific, you know, implementation per market, dependent on specific needs, you know, dependent on enforcement mechanisms. You know, how do we see, you know, virtually, you know, every country enacting their own data protection legislation that has its own sort of flavor versus, you know, a regional kind of framework that you know, each country can sort of utilize. Any thoughts from this group on that?
I'll start. I think there was a similar attempt in the past by ESCWA. They issued a directive in order to harmonize, so to speak, internet regulation across the MENA region. So they issued a directive on data protection, and it was based, I mean, it was largely based on the OECD guidelines and on the EU's former framework on data protection, which is preceded the GDPR. And unfortunately, I guess there hasn't been since, I think that was in 2012, and we haven't seen, you know, governments following that directive by adopting their national legislation based on those guidelines. But to answer your question directly, I think one of the values and the advantages of GDPR, obviously it's an EU regulation because there is data flows going between different EU countries and the single market idea, which I'm not sure we have in our region. So it's probably important to think whether we do need some sort of a pan-Arab legislation or a Mena legislation of some sort. And I also tend to think that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, because I said, like, GDPR offers us some robust principles that we can follow and adapt. And I think that's a good starting point, whereby those principles should be taken into consideration when lawmakers in our region adopt those into their own national regulation or legislation.
Yep. I agree with that, and I think that, you know, from a business perspective, and Sam, I'm curious to get your view of this, but, you know, enacting GDPR was, you know, tremendously costly for businesses to adopt and navigate, and, you know, that was quite a process. But I think every company now is acknowledging the need for regulation, and they're much closer to being able to comply with other regulations. But at the same time, you know, a unified framework is always helpful, right? Because keeping track of you know, slightly different variations and, you know, in every single country when it comes to data protection is unbelievably difficult. And so, you know, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, you know, harmonization of laws. I mean, how is Zoom kind of, you know, approaching, you know, trying to set a unified standard of data protection for all consumers, while, of course, you know, keeping track of all the new laws that are cropping up?
Well, I mean, obviously there's various aspects to data protection, but one thing I do want to touch on is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, an important part of, you know, protecting people's digital presence and so on is certainly things such as awareness, and, you know, obviously another aspect which is very important as well, which the way we see it, is the protection of those communications via encryption. So encryption is a very important thing. And for example, what we've endeavored to do is last year we introduced end-to-end encryption, which not only means that when you're talking to somebody on a meeting via video, via audio, it's encrypted, but it also means the keys, the ability of the keys, which are very important, of course, live with the participants. So if, you know, you are having a video meeting or an audio meeting with somebody, and that is a Zoom meeting, for example, then not only will it be encrypted, but the keys, which are vital to the encryption, actually live with the participants. These kind of things, I think, are very important. I think Bahat touched on the fact that it's important that the mechanisms which are in place and the infrastructure which is in place allows people using technology. Marwa touched on it also, that, you know, that use of technology has grown so much. It's education. You know, people have got married, they sit and have chats with their parents. Maybe some of these chats are things which you'd normally do in a, you know, you sat in your living room with friends and family, so they could be quite rather private. You want to feel comfortable and confident, and it's important that we all step up and provide that confidence and comfort by you know, different mechanisms, and encryption is an important one. and end-to-end encryption especially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, again, unbelievable amount of content is being hosted online. And there is, I think, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of concern. And now I feel like, it's been somewhat normalized, right? We're all online, we're always sort of on video. But then again, what does a post-pandemic look like? And I think that there are a lot of, I guess, guesses that we've shifted to a largely sort of online form of living. A lot of services, even education, is going to sort of stay online post-pandemic. And so these issues that we're facing, they're not going to disappear post-pandemic, right? If anything, and Marwa, you emphasize this, and I completely agree, this is the time for increased protections, right? We need to be enacting legislation, and companies like Zoom are trying to get ahead of that with sort of end-to-end encryption and other sort of technical protections to kind of get ahead of this digitalization of the world, essentially. So completely agree there. Moving on to sort of kind of opportunities, right, between the public and private sector. Where can we collaborate? Where can we sort of work together to provide users more transparency and control over their data? Because that's been, through this pandemic, a sort of call to action. Where can we improve and where can we work together? I guess maybe Marwa, I'll pass that on to you.
Sure. I mean, again, bringing the pandemic once again into the picture, it brought also this question of public-private partnership and what needs to be done to ensure that those are done in the public interest, done with a certain degree of transparency, of accountability. In the beginning of 2020, or at the onset of the pandemic, we've seen again, governments and companies moving together hand in hand in order to answer this or like try to find solutions in these extraordinary times we're in. And one of the things that came to our attention is that often those partnerships are done without transparency. There isn't much about which companies are the governments contracting for public-private partnerships and for what purposes, what's the data sharing modality there, who has access to what. And there's little room often also for public consultation and due diligence. We've seen companies with dismal human rights records really proposing for governments certain solutions, or opening their door for partnerships of that sort in order to address the challenges brought to us by this pandemic. And so it's extremely important for governments to ensure that there is enough due diligence on the companies they cooperate with, to ensure that their human rights record, or those companies actually do take their responsibility to protect and respect human rights seriously in accordance to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So that's it in a summary, but I'm curious to hear what Sam and Baha, especially that they're coming from the private sector, to hear their thoughts on this.
One of the, obviously, as I mentioned before, in terms of public-private partnership, we've seen a lot of take-up, obviously with COVID, various, whether they be government agencies or, citizen outreach activities have moved to virtual. So a lot of things which you would normally go into different government offices for, there's been a big push in order to make those kind of services accessible virtually. It's very important to us. As I said, I talked about encryption, so it's very important that people feel that their conversations are safe, and that's vital. It's also very important that people feel comfortable using the tools within any specific platform, Zoom, so that they can be comfortable in those conversations. They know the controls that are available to them and so on. And those are vitally important as well. I think there's a great role and there's a great benefit in terms of accessibility. If you look at education as an example, when I was younger, when you missed the class, you missed the class. And you maybe had to speak to your colleagues to tell you what you missed. Obviously now a lot more facilities are available, recordings of classes are available, the ability to maybe log in later for a repeat run or whatever. But it's important to make people comfortable with what the environment is, because it's often you're sitting in your own home, and often this will involve subjects you were not used to communicating on via video. Certainly children are not used to doing their school classes via video, as I said. So it is very important that the enablement, making people comfortable with controls, things like waiting rooms where you can get a glance at people before they join your meetings, the ability to, remove people from meetings if they prove to be disruptive or whatever. All of this is vitally important, and it's vitally important because the use cases are becoming far more widespread, whether it be in the medical area, whether it be in the education area, accessing, there are, maybe accessing financial services, potentially as well. We're all used to, maybe calling into call centers with particular protocols around that. So looking at ways of doing that, which are more related to user authentication over video platforms and so on. All of this is vitally important. Video intrinsically allows you to a degree, because obviously you see the person you're talking to often, to know them. And I think it's important to take advantage of that to provide a better experience, but always, as Uttara mentioned, to keep moving forward in a manner which makes people feel safer and also be able to use the tools more easily.
Excellent. Baha, any thoughts?
Yes, I just need to add something. If we are thinking in a more pragmatic thinking, I believe the strongest driver for applying data privacy or adopting data privacy controls is the business need and the competition. For example, in the, as Sam says, in the Zoom scenario, they started to apply encryption, although this is not a government requirement, this is not mentioned in the law, but this is a customer requirement. In the case of Zoom not applying encryption, it is a competitor that will come up and apply encryption. So the business, I think, is a very strong driver for applying the data privacy controls.
Yeah,
if I
absolutely.
can, sorry to interrupt, if I can chip in, there's a couple of, there's a couple of points I forgot to mention, because when we look at the regulation, obviously we focus on the government side of things, but looking at private companies also in the region, especially local companies or national companies, there is a lack of transparency when it comes to their privacy policies and how they are collecting data, how they're using that data. It's a common phenomenon actually for many telecommunications companies and internet service providers in different parts of the region, for example, to process and sell data actually for profit, especially to advertising companies. And obviously the lack of robust regulation in place allows each company to decide based on its own internal policies whether to sell that data or not, whether to inform their consumers or not. So, but looking at how those companies, especially ISPs and telecommunications, we've looked at those in both Jordan and Tunisia. Unfortunately, it's the overarching conclusion is that often those companies don't publish their privacy policies on their websites. There's little communications to their consumers, how they're using their data. So consumers are pretty much left in the dark as to how and what information is being collected about them. Just to give you also another concrete example to emphasize the point, in Lebanon, there is around 114 internet service provider. And I think only 34 of those have a website, and only 4 of those have a privacy policy published on their website. So that really speaks to the issue of privacy at large on the side of private companies. And then, so going back to the question of public-private partnership, it's important also to use that to push for more privacy, even when there is no legislation in place. And then again, you know, the importance of due diligence, data protection impact assessments before you roll out these technologies, human rights impact assessments, and provide much transparency about those. And again, you know, just from the perspective of civil society, is to ensure that there is enough public consultation and inclusive consultation, particularly when those technologies are used for the public interest and can impact our societies at a larger extent.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Marwa. I think, you know, regulation is an important tool, but it by itself is not going to match the pace of technology, right? And so it is really incumbent upon companies to find and consistently reevaluate their bar for privacy, right? And I think that one part of doing that is just consumer accountability, right? The more transparent you are, you know, you have public shareholders and public stakeholders that are holding you accountable. So it's really insufficient to just rely on one piece of this, right? You know, there absolutely needs to be common sense regulation, and to the extent that that can be harmonized regionally, I think that's a huge benefit to companies. But at the same time, you know, each company has to really evaluate their data practices and make sure that they're not just staying compliant, but also matching the pace of what consumers expect. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that consumers are expecting more and more from companies when it comes to transparency. And that's just, you know, we're gonna have to rise to the occasion. So with that, let me turn to the Q&A. I see we have quite a few questions, which is great. I'll start with the first one, which I believe is for Sam. The Zoom platform has seen a huge spike in usage over the last year. How are you ensuring that the mass data you're collecting remains secure? And I think, Sam, you did mention, you know, your efforts on encryption, which I think is incredibly important. Something that, you know, I think every company is assessing. But anything more you'd want to add?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's one thing I want to emphasize. So Zoom doesn't sell any of our users' data. So we never sold user data in the past, no intention of selling users' data in the future. Also, we don't monitor meeting or its contents in any way. And as I mentioned, obviously your meetings are protected by end-to-end encryption, which means they're encrypted with really powerful encryption and the keys are with the participants. In addition to that, obviously we publish a privacy policy and we take privacy extremely seriously. And in addition, we have elements of that which are available for use, for viewing. We have a K-12 schools and districts privacy policy as well, because taking on board the specific aspects of, you know, Children's Online Privacy Act, that's COPA in the US, GDPR, and so on and so forth. So we, in general, we do as much as we can via transparency, as I said, publishing all of these things. And you mentioned via technological enhancements such as end-to-end encryption, such as waiting rooms. The essence of it is we don't sell in any way user data, and we make sure the contents of meetings are encrypted and private to those participants in the meeting. So vital things. Now, obviously with a big spike in usage, that was certainly challenging in the early days. And we went, you know, I could probably remember in a second, but we had a tremendous spike of usage across the whole region. It accelerated, I think, we within a week of being unblocked, we hit 100,000 and then it spiked 900% to the end of that month. And then obviously continued to grow. So we've had, you know, very substantial growth in usage. And that's really what highlighted some of the early issues, which I mentioned, such as meeting disruption and so on, where we realized very quickly that there was a three-pronged approach, having the right policies, having the right technologies, and also working very hard with user awareness and enablement to make sure users knew how to get the most out of the tools in terms of security and safety.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam. Next question is for Marwa. What are some tactics to encourage governments to develop modern data protection laws that are favorable to new technologies and which meet global tech companies' data protection standards?
Yeah, I want to emphasize that the protection of users or citizens' privacy is actually a positive responsibility of governments in the region. The right to privacy is enshrined in many of the constitutions across the MENA region. Of course, I appreciate and understand the differences and disparities between different parts of our region, but that being said, governments do have that obligation. And I'm conscious that there's often an argument that, you know, having a robust data protection law would spark and encourage innovation, especially when we talk about data flaws, adequacy with the EU, especially with the EU, etc. But the result of that, unfortunately, is that we've seen data protection laws in the region being adopted that are specifically modeled in a way that would encourage investment, would encourage building data centers, would encourage innovation and business growth on the one hand, but the data subject, as in the user or the citizen, is often absent. And so it's, as I mentioned, you know, earlier on, it is important to keep this user at the very center and heart of these data protection laws and ensure that they are human rights respecting. And also for governments to understand that when you have a robust data protection law, obviously it's good for businesses. As Baha mentioned, you know, it gives businesses and private companies a better direction on what to do with their consumers' data, especially as we'll be collecting more and more and more data, and you know, we do exist in this virtual world as much as we exist in the actual world, and us as citizens or as users, we need to gain back the control and agency about our personal data. And that should not be seen as something that is in tension or in contradiction with business growth or with innovation and so on. So we hope we see more of those regulations coming in the region, and we at Access Now are very excited and happy to work with lawmakers and policymakers to ensure that those frameworks are in place.
Absolutely. I think many times that question is phrased as sort of a trade-off between innovation and you know, privacy. And I think that, you know, I think moving forward, they don't necessarily have to be trade-offs, right? You know, part of innovating is making sure that you know, products work for consumers in a way that benefits them and a way that, you know, considers their privacy and incorporates their privacy rights. And so, you know, moving forward, again, I don't think that necessarily has to be a trade-off, but certainly in practice, there's going to be some, you know, some challenge. So I think that's what we're all preparing for. The next question for Sam, what are some of the key successes and challenges, excuse me, Zoom faced with the easing of voice over IP restrictions in the UAE this year?
Yes, I mean, I think I partially answered some of that. As I said, obviously, among the key challenges was suddenly there were a large number of use cases, education, healthcare, many different things at the same time. And so it was being able to continue to serve those customers, enhance awareness of how to get the most out, and also, you know, have the right security posture in place for users. Things like using waiting rooms, things like not publishing meeting, joining credentials publicly, all of these things. I mentioned we started a service to ask at-risk notifier, so we notify meeting organizers if we believe the meeting is at risk from disruption. Also guardrailing, specifically K-12, so putting in place guardrails to protect K-12 students through particular privacy protections and so on and so forth. All of this was part of what we introduced during 2020. In addition, and obviously this is something which may appear obvious, but it's very important to maintain the quality and efficacy. At the end of the day, people are meeting family, people, believe it or not, getting married, attending family functions and so on and so forth. It's very important to allow people to get the most out of these things, to help to enhance the continuality of some kind of normality during, what were exceptional times, and also to provide opportunities for businesses to continue doing what they're doing. If you're a lawyer or a consultant or even a, fitness instructor or something, allowing people to continue their businesses in this way is something which is clearly, it's a source of importance and pride.
Thanks, Sam. Going through these questions. Looks like there's one for me. Years ago, there was a project by Uber to share real-time traffic data for the benefit of users, the market, and the regulatory authorities. Where did this project go? I believe I believe you're referring to Uber Movement, which was a project that we embarked on, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, to share more information about traffic patterns that could help local governments with their transportation and infrastructure planning. To me, a really fantastic and important project to find data that is in aggregate and anonymous form that can also serve public policy uses. And that was something, that we invested, quite a bit in, because Uber is subject to a number of requests for data for transportation planning purposes, right? And that's important and something we want to support and absolutely partner with cities to do. And so that was really a fantastic project. I think, moving forward, we need to find more areas where aggregated and anonymized data can be used for important public policy purposes. I think that's a win-win, frankly. And I think that, again, there's so much focus on, in the context of government data sharing, there's so much focus on, sharing personal data and sharing, individual, highly granular data, when in reality, it's really the aggregated data that has the insights, right? And that's what's going to be used for large public policy making. And so I think, it's in everyone's interest to have really smart data-driven public policy. And to the extent that we can, come to a common denominator or come to an agreement on what that data can be, I think, again, that's just a win-win between, businesses and government. So, that project is, is still online, and I recommend you check it out for various countries. But something that's an ongoing discussion in Uber, right? How do we support local governments with data that doesn't reveal personal information? Let's see. There's one for Foudy. Would love to pass it to you, Baha. What are Foudy's efforts to raise users' awareness about the optimum usage of data? I'm not quite sure what the optimum usage of data is, but Baha, I'll pass it to you to maybe interpret that.
Okay, I'll try to understand the question as much as I can. The issue with Foudy is it is scattered all over the country. Egypt is a very huge country with many people, so it is scattered all over the country, and there are the point of sales that are everywhere. We have about 200,000 point of sales. And maybe in some transactions, some information is collected. Like if you are paying a bill, for example, your mobile bill. So we need your mobile number, we need your name. So this basic information. And actually the 200,000 machines in the country, they are working in small kiosk. So maybe this information, information is not collected only by Fawry. It is also collected by the merchant that is having this point of sale. So the challenge here is how to protect this information by not allowing the merchant to keep this information for himself. So this is actually very challenging because of the huge number of merchants and the geographical presence of them. So it is very, very hard. But we are doing some efforts relating to making sessions for these merchants and raising awareness for them, and also raising awareness for the consumer itself who is providing this data to the merchant, that his data is used only in the point of sale. It is not used in somewhere outside this machine. So this is very challenging, and I think we are doing some efforts there. It needs some improvement, I think, because of the huge amount of channels. So, but we're working on it. And I think this is also one of the challenges with COVID-19, that many people are depending on these services all over the country. So, and all of this is of a sudden, so we don't even have the time to assess what's happening, what's going on, to apply the proper controls. So, but actually we're doing our best, and there is a huge effort done in this area.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you for your questions. A huge thank you to the panelists for joining us today and lending their expertise. And also, you know, a thank you to the Uber team for hosting this. I genuinely think this is a topic that we need to talk about more, especially in this region, while, you know, there's so much opportunity, right? There's so much opportunity for regulation that really builds on, you know, what GDPR sort of has set as an example. There's a tremendous potential for improvement. And, you know, COVID has really accelerated, you know, this move to digital services. So in my mind, there's no better time for, you know, the companies and the public sector to work together with everything that we've learned. So thank you again. It has been a pleasure moderating, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Thank you.